The whole town laughed when the old veteran built a steel arch over his cabin in the mountains of Colorado. Wrapped in his red and black flannel, he said nothing, only kept building, with his loyal German shepherd at his side. They called it useless. They called him crazy. Until the worst winter in decades arrived. When roofs began to collapse and the wind turned deadly, the same neighbors came knocking on his door, begging for shelter beneath the arch they once mocked. What happened inside that steel shell would save lives, unite a broken town, and turn a ridiculed idea into a legend. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel and who they reach. Winter settled over Leadville early, the thin mountain air cutting like glass, while wind swept down from the peaks and pressed cold into every crack of the land. Walter Hayes arrived on the outskirts of town on a morning when frost coated the pine needles and the sky hung low and colorless, the kind of sky that promised long months of endurance rather than beauty. He was 72 years old, broad-shouldered despite the stoop that age and old injuries had pressed into his spine, with a weathered face cut by deep lines that spoke of sun, wind, and years spent squinting into danger. A thick gray beard covered his jaw, trimmed short out of habit rather than vanity, and beneath the brim of a faded wool cap his eyes were pale blue, sharp, and constantly measuring. He wore the same heavy red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket every day, the fabric softened by decades of use but still sturdy, the cuffs frayed where his hands had once rested on rifle stocks and later on steering wheels and tools. He spoke little, moved with purpose, and carried the quiet vigilance of a man who had learned, long ago, that attention could mean survival. At his side walked Max, a German shepherd well into his final years, his muzzle dusted with gray, his frame still powerful but slower now, each step deliberate. Max's coat was thick and dark, his ears alert despite his age, his amber eyes steady and intelligent. The eyes of a dog who had spent his life watching over one man and seeing him through more nights than either cared to count. They had found each other years earlier, both discarded in different ways, and neither had ever learned how to live without the other. The cabin Walter purchased sat alone on a windswept slope just beyond Leadville's last clustered houses, a simple structure of aged logs and patched shingles that had been abandoned after one winter too many. The townspeople said it was cursed by exposure, by wind that screamed down the mountain like a living thing, by snowdrifts that buried roofs and snapped beams without mercy. Walter bought it anyway, paying cash with money saved from a modest pension and years of frugality. He did not tell anyone why he chose that place. He only unloaded his tools, walked the perimeter with Max at his heel, and began to work. Within days, curiosity turned to amusement. Walter erected heavy anchors in the frozen ground and began assembling curved steel ribs, bolting them together into a rising arc that dwarfed the cabin beneath it. The structure looked alien against the timber and stone, a massive half-cylinder of corrugated metal climbing toward the sky. People drove out to see it, standing with hands in pockets, breath fogging the air as laughter drifted across the slope. One of them was Tom Callahan, a stocky man in his 50s with a red face and a booming voice, known in Leadville for running a hardware store and for speaking his mind whether invited or not. Tom leaned against his pickup, shaking his head as he watched Walter tighten bolts without looking up. "That old man finally lost it," he said loudly to no one in particular. "Building a barn over a house. What's he planning to do? Shelter cows in his living room?" Others chuckled, not cruelly, but with the easy confidence of people who believed winter was something you endured the way your fathers had taught you, not something you reinvented. Walter heard them all. He always did. But he did not answer, because laughter had never been the loudest sound he'd survived. Years earlier, overseas, he had learned what real noise was, what it meant when the ground shook and the air filled with metal and fire. Those memories had carved him into someone who trusted preparation more than approval. As he worked, his thoughts returned not to the voices behind him, but to nights when cold crept into bones and hesitation cost lives. He remembered the way wind found weakness, the way snow piled until structures failed, the way men froze not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked shelter. He was not building for comfort. He was building because winter, like war, respected only those who planned ahead. Max stayed close, often lying near the base of the growing arch, head on his paws, eyes tracking every movement. When strangers approached too closely, he rose slowly, his presence alone enough to remind them that this land was claimed. Children from town came once, daring each other to shout jokes toward the old veteran. Max did not bark, but he stood, broad chest forward, and the children backed away, suddenly unsure whether laughter was worth testing that silent authority. Among the onlookers was Sarah Whitcomb, a woman in her early 40s who taught at the small elementary school in town. She was tall and slender, with straight chestnut hair usually pulled into a practical braid, her skin pale from long winters spent indoors, her eyes thoughtful and observant. Unlike the others, she did not laugh. She watched Walter work with a frown of concentration, sensing something deliberate in the way he measured and tightened, the way he paused to consider wind direction before placing each rib. Sarah had grown up in Leadville and had seen winters take more than people expected. Her husband had died 5 years earlier in a road accident during a snowstorm, and since then she had learned to look past appearances. When she asked Tom what the structure was for, he shrugged. "Crazy project," he said. "He'll learn." Sarah wasn't so sure. Days passed, and the arch grew higher. Walter's hand cracked and bled despite gloves. His shoulders burned each night, but he welcomed the pain because it meant progress. Inside his chest, beneath layers of discipline, there was something close to relief. Each bolt tightened was a small promise kept, a reminder that he could still protect what mattered. He spoke to Max while they worked, not in long conversations, but in the low, steady tone he had always used, a voice that carried reassurance more than words. Max answered with quiet obedience, sometimes lifting his head when the wind howled, sometimes pressing against Walter's leg as if to anchor him to the present. By the time the first serious snowfall dusted the slope, the steel arch stood unmistakably complete, casting a long shadow over the cabin. It looked strange, excessive, almost defiant. Laughter continued, though now tinged with curiosity. People wondered how it would hold, how it would fail, and how long before the old man admitted defeat. Walter did not invite anyone inside. He built in silence, driven by memories no one else could see, and by an understanding shaped by years when survival depended not on hope, but on design. As the temperature dropped and the mountain wind sharpened, he fastened the final panel and stepped back, resting one gloved hand on Max's head. The town laughed behind him, unaware that winter was listening, and that it would soon decide who had prepared wisely and who had mistaken ridicule for truth. The steel arch did not rise by accident, and it did not rise easily. In the days after the laughter on the slope faded into routine gossip, Walter Hayes returned to the habits that had once kept him alive when routines were all that stood between order and chaos. Each morning before dawn, while Leadville still slept beneath a thin crust of ice, he stepped outside in his red and black flannel jacket, breath slow and controlled, and stood facing the wind. He listened to it the way other men listen to weather reports, not as noise but as information, the direction, the pitch, the way it slid down the mountain and curled around the exposed cabin told him where pressure would build, where snow would drift, where failure would begin if he allowed it. These instincts were not learned from books. They had been etched into him years earlier, inside steel bunkers half buried in sand and fear, where flat walls cracked and collapsed, while curved roofs bent and held. Walter had not spoken of those years to anyone in Leadville, and no one had asked. His past clung to him in subtler ways, in the stiffness of his right knee when the temperature dropped, in the faint tremor that passed through his hands when sudden noise broke the silence, and in the way he never turned his back fully to open space. Survival had shaped him into a man who trusted systems over promises, preparation over optimism. The arch was simply an extension of that belief. He sourced the steel quietly. 20 miles north of town, beyond a line of abandoned switchbacks, lay the remnants of a silver mine that had failed decades earlier, leaving behind rusting panels, bent ribs, and half-collapsed sheds. The mine caretaker, a gaunt man named Elias Porter, with nicotine-stained fingers and a perpetual cough, barely looked up when Walter asked about the scrap. Elias was in his late 60s, tall but hollowed out, his skin gray and stretched tight over bone, a man whose life had been shaped by dust and disappointment. He shrugged and waved a hand. "Take what you can haul," he rasped. "Ain't worth anything to me." Walter paid him anyway, a habit born of principle rather than necessity. The work of hauling nearly broke him. He hitched a borrowed trailer to his aging pickup and made trip after trip, the mountain road unforgiving beneath early ice. Steel panels bit into his gloves, tore fabric, scraped skin. Once, when the trailer skidded on a bend, Walter corrected without panic, muscles moving on instinct long before thought followed. Max rode in the passenger seat, ears forward, every sense alert, as if the truck were another convoy pushing through hostile ground. When they returned to the cabin each evening, Walter's shoulders burned and his hands shook, but he slept deeply, the kind of sleep that came only after honest exhaustion. As the arch took shape, its purpose became clearer, though no less strange to the townspeople. Walter anchored it deep, pouring concrete footings that disappeared 4 feet into frozen earth. He bolted each curved rib with methodical precision, checking alignment again and again. Curves distributed force, he reminded himself. Pressure flowed rather than gathered. Flat roofs challenged winter. Curved ones invited it to pass. Inside his mind, memories surfaced uninvited. A steel shelter half buried after an explosion, snow sliding off its rounded top while nearby structures failed. Men huddled beneath a curve of metal, breathing steam into darkness, alive because someone had understood shape. He did not dwell on those images, but they guided his hands. Max assumed his post without instruction. He lay at the open end of the arch, his thick coat dusted with frost, head resting on crossed paws, eyes never fully closing. At 10 years old, his movements were slower, but his presence carried weight. His body bore old scars, pale lines beneath fur, souvenirs from a life that had not always been gentle. When strangers approached too close, he did not growl. He rose. That was enough. Children stopped daring one another to cross invisible boundaries. Adults felt the unspoken warning and respected it, even if they did not fully understand why. Sarah Whitcomb returned more than once, parking her car at a respectful distance and watching from the edge of the property. She had begun bringing binoculars, the kind she used on field trips with her students, though she never admitted that to anyone. Through them, she observed details others missed: how Walter angled panels to guide runoff, how he paused to account for sun exposure even in winter, how he reinforced stress points with doubled steel. Sarah herself was a careful observer by nature. Years of teaching had trained her to notice small shifts in behavior, quiet signals of struggle or resilience. Her husband's death had sharpened that awareness into something almost painful. She recognized in Walter the same quiet stubbornness she had seen in herself after loss, the refusal to explain, the determination to endure without spectacle. One afternoon, as snow began to fall in earnest, Tom Callahan drove up again, this time alone. He stood watching the nearly completed arch, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Up close, Tom looked older than his laughter suggested, his beard more gray than red, his eyes tired. He had lost his brother years earlier to a collapsed roof during a heavy winter storm, a fact few people remembered and even fewer mentioned. It had made him loud, dismissive, allergic to ideas that challenged what he understood. He cleared his throat. "You really think that thing's going to hold?" he asked, not mocking now, just blunt. Walter tightened a final bolt and climbed down slowly. "I don't think," he replied. "I know how steel behaves under load." Tom nodded once, absorbing that, and left without another word. By late November, the arch stood complete, a massive steel shell encasing empty air and promise. Inside it, Walter began constructing the cabin itself, shielded now from the worst of the weather. Snow fell steadily outside, piling harmlessly against the curved exterior before sliding away. Wind roared overhead, its force redirected and broken. Walter worked in relative calm, stacking logs, setting beams, his movements precise and unhurried. For the first time since arriving in Leadville, he allowed himself a quiet acknowledgement of satisfaction. Not pride. Satisfaction was different. Pride sought recognition. Satisfaction required only function. At night, he sat by a temporary stove beneath the arch, Max curled nearby, and listened to the wind test the structure. Each gust was a question. Each unanswered challenge reinforced his resolve. He spoke aloud once, voice low, almost reverent. "You can't rush survival." Max lifted his head, tail thumping once in agreement, or perhaps simply in comfort. The town continued to talk, though the laughter softened into speculation. People wondered how long the old veteran's experiment would last, whether it would fail spectacularly or quietly. Walter did not concern himself with their expectations. He had seen worse storms than the ones forecasted. He had lived through nights when the only thing separating him from death was a thin curve of steel and the will to endure. As December approached and temperatures plunged further, Walter Hayes worked beneath his arch, preparing not just a home, but a defense. Winter was no longer an abstraction. It was advancing, methodical and patient, and Walter was ready to meet it on his own terms. January arrived without ceremony, the way real danger often does, quietly at first, and then all at once, with the sky darkening into a solid mass and the air sharpening until every breath burned. The storm that descended on Leadville was not the kind spoken of lightly over coffee. It was the kind old men remembered with lowered voices, the kind that erased tracks within minutes and turned familiar streets into disorienting white corridors where sound vanished and direction became guesswork. Snow fell sideways, driven by wind so fierce it seemed to claw at walls and pry at roofs, testing every joint and weakness. The temperature dropped fast, plunging into a range where exposed skin numbed in seconds and mistakes became fatal within hours. Walter Hayes felt it before the radio crackled warnings. He sensed it in the way the wind shifted abruptly, abandoning its steady pattern for erratic surges, in the pressure change that throbbed behind his eyes, in Max's sudden restlessness. Max paced the interior of the arch, nails clicking softly against concrete, ears twitching at sounds too distant for human hearing. At 10 years old, his joints ached in the cold, but his instincts were intact, sharpened by years of guarding and waiting. Walter watched him for a moment, then reached down and rested a firm hand on the dog's broad head. "Easy," he murmured. "This is what we built for." Outside the arch, the storm unleashed itself fully. Snow slammed against the steel shell with a hollow roar, piling up briefly before sliding away in heavy sheets, exactly as Walter had intended. Wind howled over the curved surface, its force redirected upward, unable to find purchase. Inside, the air remained still. Walter fed the stove with dry wood stacked neatly along the interior walls, the flames catching quickly, radiating steady heat. The cabin beneath the arch was not luxurious, but it was sound. Thick log walls, tight seams, a roof that bore almost no weight because the steel above carried the burden. Walter removed his gloves, flexed his fingers, and allowed himself a long, slow breath. This was not luck. This was preparation paying its debt. In town, the experience was very different. Roofs groaned under accumulating snow, beams strained and snapped, and the wind forced itself through poorly sealed windows and warped doors. Tom Callahan's hardware store was one of the first to suffer. He was inside when the sound changed from creaking to cracking, a sharp report that froze him in place. Tom was a solid man, thick-necked and strong, but panic erased strength quickly. He barely made it out the back door before the front section collapsed inward, snow and timber exploding into the space where he had stood moments earlier. The memory of his brother, crushed years ago under similar circumstances, flashed through his mind with brutal clarity. And this time there was no laughter, no dismissal, only fear and the understanding that Winter did not care about confidence. Across town, Sarah Whitcomb huddled in her small rented house with 3 neighbors who had nowhere else to go. She wrapped blankets around trembling shoulders, her movements calm despite the pounding of her heart. Sarah's face, pale even in good weather, had taken on a gray cast, her lips cracked from the cold. Her hair, once neatly braided, hung loose and damp with condensation. She thought of her students, of whether their families had prepared enough, and she thought, unbidden, of the steel arch on the slope. She wondered if the old veteran had been right all along, if survival truly came down to shape and foresight rather than tradition. The storm intensified through the night. Visibility dropped to nothing. Power lines failed. Fires sparked where stoves tipped or chimneys clogged, quickly smothered by snow, but leaving families homeless all the same. By morning, Leadville was barely recognizable. Drifts rose higher than fences, burying cars and blocking doors. The temperature hovered well below zero, and the wind refused to rest. People ventured out only when absolutely necessary, faces rapt, movements slow and deliberate, fear tightening every gesture. Inside the arch, Walter and Max passed the hours in quiet vigilance. Walter read by lantern light, cooked simple meals, and checked the structure repeatedly, listening for any change in sound or vibration. Each inspection confirmed what he already knew. The arch was holding. Snow continued to shed cleanly, sliding away before it could accumulate dangerously. Max eventually settled near the stove, his breathing slow and even, the picture of a dog who trusted the shelter implicitly. Watching him, Walter felt something loosen in his chest, a rare sensation bordering on peace. For once, the world outside could rage without reaching him. On the second day of the storm, the sound of wind shifted again, dropping from a scream to a low, sustained moan. Walter stepped to the open end of the arch, careful not to expose himself fully, and peered out. The landscape beyond was buried, smoothed into unnatural curves and ridges by drifting snow. He could see smoke in the distance, dark and wrong against the white. Not the steady plume of a chimney, but the uneven smear of something burning where it should not. His jaw tightened. Experience told him what that meant. By the time the storm finally broke on the third morning, leaving behind an eerie, blinding stillness, Leadville was wounded. Buildings sagged or lay in pieces, streets were impassable, and people wandered in shock, searching for help, for warmth, for anything solid. It did not take long for word to spread about the cabin under the steel arch, the one structure that had stood unmarked while others failed. Tom Callahan arrived first. His beard rimed with ice, eyes bloodshot and hollow. He looked smaller somehow, his usual bluster stripped away by exhaustion and fear. He stared at the arch, then at Walter, disbelief and something like awe crossing his face. "It worked," he said hoarsely. Not a question, but a statement. Others followed. Families with children, elderly couples, a few men carrying what little they had salvaged. Their faces were raw from cold, their movements stiff and desperate. Walter did not ask for apologies. He did not point out past laughter. He simply stepped aside and waved them in. Inside the arch, the air was warmer, calmer, the steel shell holding back the chaos of the world. People sank to the ground in relief, some crying openly, others silent and shaking. Max moved among them, slow and gentle, allowing hands to rest on his thick fur, absorbing fear without complaint. Walter organized without raising his voice, the same way he had once organized men under pressure. He directed where to sit, how to share heat, when to feed the stove. There was no heroism in his actions, no drama, only necessity and a deeply ingrained sense of responsibility. As night fell again, the arch filled with quiet murmurs and the crackle of firewood. Outside, the town lay broken and humbled. Inside, beneath curved steel and careful planning, people lived. Morning broke slowly over the wreckage of Leadville, the light thin and pale, revealing what the storm had taken with merciless clarity. People arrived at Walter Hayes's steel arch in ones and twos at first, then in small clusters, moving carefully through knee-deep drifts, their bodies hunched against the cold, as if winter might strike again at any moment. They stood at the entrance without knocking, hats clutched in stiff hands, faces raw and reddened, eyes hollow with exhaustion and disbelief. These were the same faces that had once worn amused smiles, the same mouths that had laughed at the idea of a cabin wrapped in steel. Now there was no laughter left in them, only the fragile hope that the rumors were true. Walter opened the entrance without ceremony, his red and black flannel jacket stark against the whiteness outside, his expression unchanged. He did not ask who they were or why they had come. He stepped aside, a simple gesture that carried more meaning than any apology. Inside the arch, warmth rolled outward, and the smell of wood smoke and hot broth followed, tangible proof that survival was possible. Tom Callahan entered first, shoulders slumped, his thick frame diminished by fatigue. Up close, the angles of his face looked harsher than before, his beard rimmed with ice, his eyes bloodshot from smoke and sleeplessness. He could barely meet Walter's gaze. Behind him came a young couple with a toddler wrapped in too many layers, then an elderly man leaning heavily on a cane, his breath rattling in his chest. Walter moved immediately, directing them with short, efficient phrases, his voice steady and calm. He pointed to areas along the inside curve of the arch where bedding could be laid out, where heat would collect naturally, where drafts were weakest. He split his remaining daylight between tasks without hesitation, stacking additional firewood closer to the stove, ladling soup into mismatched cups, ensuring the children were closest to warmth. His movements were economical, the habits of command returning without effort. This was not leadership born of ego. It was leadership shaped by necessity. Sarah Whitcomb arrived not long after, guiding two of her neighbors through the snow. She looked different than she had days earlier, her tall, slender frame wrapped in borrowed coats, her pale face drawn and shadowed beneath tired eyes. Her chestnut hair, usually neat, was tangled and escaping its tie, framing her face in damp strands. Yet there was a quiet resolve in her posture, the same steadiness she brought into classrooms during chaos. When she saw the interior of the arch, the order within it, something like relief softened her features. She met Walter's eyes briefly, gratitude unspoken but unmistakable. He nodded once, acknowledging her presence without words, then gestured toward a cleared space where she could help organize the women and children. Sarah understood immediately, stepping into the role as naturally as if she had been doing it all her life. More people followed as the hours passed. Among them was Martha Klein, a woman in her late 40s with prematurely silver hair cut short around a lined, expressive face. She had been known in town as sharp-tongued and independent, the kind of person who laughed loudest at what she considered foolishness. Now her sharpness had dulled into something brittle, her hands trembling as she removed wet gloves. She avoided Walter's eyes, but when Max approached her slowly, his thick fur brushing her leg, she dropped to her knees and buried her face against his shoulder, sobbing with a rawness that surprised even herself. Max stood still, patient and accepting, his amber eyes soft. He had learned long ago that some people needed permission to break before they could be whole again. Walter kept the cabin door closed. It was not an act of selfishness, nor was it cruelty. The cabin was his anchor, his private space, the place where he rested and remembered who he was when the world was quiet. Instead, he transformed the arch itself into a communal shelter. Bedrolls were laid out in careful rows, blankets shared, and supplies inventoried. Walter set up a second stove in the open area, its heat supplementing the first, creating a pocket of livable warmth beneath the steel curve. He rationed food without drawing attention to scarcity, making it feel deliberate rather than desperate. When someone asked how long they could stay, he answered simply, "As long as it takes." No conditions, no resentment. Children adapted fastest. They curled together on blankets, whispering, their fear easing as warmth seeped back into small limbs. Max made slow circuits among them, accepting clumsy hugs and resting his heavy head on knees as if he understood his role perfectly. At 10 years old, his body carried the weight of time, his movements slower, but his presence was powerful. He became a living reassurance, a reminder that something solid and dependable existed in the chaos. Walter watched him quietly, a familiar ache tightening his chest. Max had been there through years of silence and nights when the past pressed too close. Seeing him offer that same steadiness to others felt right, as if this moment had always been waiting for them. As night fell, the arch filled with low conversation, the murmurs of people sharing fragments of loss and relief. Tom Callahan sat near the stove, his hands extended toward the heat, staring into the flames. At last he spoke, his voice rough. "I was wrong," he said, not looking up. The words hung in the air, heavy but sincere. Walter glanced at him, then returned to stirring a pot of soup. "Being wrong won't kill you," he replied evenly. "Winter will, if you let it." There was no bitterness in his tone, only fact. Tom nodded, swallowing hard, the weight of his past laughter settling into something like humility. Later, as the fire burned lower and the arch grew quiet, Sarah found herself standing beside Walter near the stacked wood. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. Walter shrugged. "In war, the ones who survive are the ones who share," he replied, echoing words that had guided him through worse nights than this. "Hoarding only works until it doesn't." Sarah studied his face, the deep lines etched by years of endurance, the calm eyes that had seen too much to be easily shaken. She realized then that his structure was more than steel and geometry. It was an extension of his belief that survival meant responsibility, not isolation. By midnight, the arch had become something unrecognizable from its original purpose. It was no longer just a shell protecting a cabin. It was a living space, filled with breath and quiet resilience. Outside, Leadville lay broken and humbled beneath the stars. But inside the steel curve, people slept, warmed by shared heat and an unspoken understanding. Walter sat awake a while longer, listening to the steady sounds of life continuing despite everything. When he finally rested, Max settled beside him, pressing close, both of them knowing without words that this too was part of what they had built. Spring did not arrive in Leadville all at once. It crept in cautiously, testing the ground the way survivors tested unfamiliar silence after a battle. Snow retreated in uneven patches, revealing earth darkened by meltwater and roofs still bearing the scars of collapse. But something else thawed, too. Something less visible and far more lasting. The town that emerged from the winter was not the same one that had laughed on the slope months earlier. People moved differently now. They spoke more quietly. They listened. Walter Hayes noticed the change long before anyone said it out loud. He saw it in the way neighbors nodded instead of smirked when they passed the steel arch, in the way trucks slowed near his property, drivers studying the curve of metal with thoughtful eyes rather than amusement. Requests began as questions, tentative and respectful. How deep should the anchors go? What gauge steel had he used? How wide did the curve need to be to shed snow properly? Walter answered without ceremony, sometimes with words, sometimes by simply handing over tools and showing instead of explaining. He did not charge for his knowledge. He never had. To him, information that kept people alive was not a commodity. Tom Callahan was among the first to follow his example. The hardware store owner looked thinner in the spring light, his face more deeply lined, his beard now streaked with white. The storm had stripped something from him, pride perhaps, and left behind a quieter, more careful man. He began reinforcing his rebuilt store with curved steel ribs, swallowing his old skepticism along with each bolt tightened. Others followed. By early summer, new structures began to dot the outskirts of Leadville. Cabins wrapped in protective arches, sheds reinforced with curved shells, homes designed not to challenge winter, but to endure it. No one laughed anymore. Winter had answered every argument. Sarah Whitcomb became an unlikely bridge between Walter and the town. She spent long afternoons on the slope, sleeves rolled up, her tall, slender frame moving with surprising strength as she helped measure and mark foundations. Her chestnut hair was usually tucked beneath a scarf now, her pale skin freckled from more time outdoors than she had ever allowed herself before. Teaching had always been about preparation, she realized, anticipating needs before they became emergencies. In Walter's designs, she saw the same philosophy made tangible. She listened closely, asked thoughtful questions, and quietly began documenting the process, sketching diagrams and writing notes late into the night. It was not ambition that drove her, but a sense of duty sharpened by loss. She had lost a husband to a storm once. She would not lose students, neighbors, or herself to another if she could help it. As summer deepened, Leadville rebuilt not just its structures, but its sense of community. People worked together in ways they never had before, sharing labor, tools, and meals. The steel arch became a symbol, though Walter never intended it to be one. It stood unchanged, weathered slightly now, but solid, its purpose fulfilled without spectacle. Inside, Walter returned to a quieter life, though it was never solitary again. He spent mornings maintaining the structure, afternoons helping others, evenings sitting beneath the arch with Max at his side, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. He still wore his red and black flannel jacket, even in warmer weather, the fabric part of him now, a familiar weight that grounded him. Years passed. Leadville prospered modestly, wisely. Winters came and went, still fierce but less deadly. The arches held. Knowledge spread outward, carried by travelers, contractors, and word of mouth rather than patents or profit. Walter grew older, his movements slower, his beard fully white now, his hands knotted with arthritis. Max aged beside him, his once dark coat fading, his muzzle silvered, his steps measured and careful. At 12, then 13, Max slept more than he watched, but he never abandoned his post. He lay near the entrance of the arch, just as he had during the storm, ears flicking at distant sounds, eyes half open, guarding a place that had become more than shelter. Max died quietly one autumn morning. Walter found him where he always rested, curled near the threshold, his breathing stilled as if he had simply chosen to stop. The dog's body was thinner now, his fur coarse beneath Walter's trembling hand, but his expression was peaceful. There was no drama in his passing, no struggle, just an end to a long watch. Walter sat with him for a long time, the silence pressing in harder than any storm ever had. He buried Max at the entrance of the arch, beneath a simple marker, where snow would never pile and footsteps would pass often. People from town came without being asked. They stood with heads bowed, not because Max had been just a dog, but because everyone understood what he had been, a constant, a presence, a quiet strength that had steadied them when nothing else could. Walter lived on beneath the steel arch for many more years. He moved less, spoke even less, but remained deeply woven into the life of the town. Children grew up knowing his story, though he never told it himself. They knew him as the man in the flannel jacket, the one who built something that saved lives. Not a hero in the dramatic sense, but something rarer. A man who prepared, shared, and stayed. When he finally passed, quietly in his sleep during a mild winter, Leadville did not mourn loudly. It did not need to. The evidence of his life stood all around them, in the curved roofs, in the absence of fear when storms came, in the understanding that survival was not about bravado, but about foresight and compassion. They did not remember Walter Hayes primarily as a veteran, though he had been one. They remembered him as the man who turned preparation into kindness, who transformed a ridiculed idea into a refuge, and who taught an entire town that the strongest legacy was not steel or shelter, but the willingness to protect one another before disaster demanded it. In the end, this story was never just about steel, snow, or survival. It was about a quiet miracle one that didn't arrive with thunder or angels in the sky, but with wisdom placed gently in a man's hands long before the storm ever came. Some people call it preparation. Others call it experience. But many would call it grace. Because when the cold came, when fear spread faster than the wind, and when everything familiar collapsed, there was one place that stood not by chance but by design, and perhaps that design was guided by something greater than human hands alone. A reminder that God often works through ordinary people, planting insight in their hearts long before we understand why. In our own lives, the storms don't always look like blizzards. Sometimes they come as illness, loss, loneliness, or sudden change. And just like Walter, we are given quiet moments, small warnings, gentle nudges to prepare, to care, to build something that can hold when life turns cold. The miracle isn't that the arch survived. The miracle is that one man chose to share it. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on what you're building in your own life, not just for yourself, but for others. Who might need shelter from a storm you haven't seen yet? Please share this story with someone who could use hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, your city, your state, or your country. And if stories like this matter to you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing faith, resilience, and quiet miracles together. May God bless you and protect you. May He guide your steps, strengthen your heart, and place you under His shelter when the storms come. And may you, in turn, become shelter for someone else.